So, thank you all for coming to this. Our lecture is going to be on both issues with anthropocentrism and some research that we're doing with that, and self-actualization and how we as non-humans can confront these issues for our own personal growth. And in case you don't know us, I'm Nøkken. I'm a horse therianthrope, and I've been with the community for like 20 years, since like the late 90s. First found the community through internet relay chat and all of that, and I was like a baby at the time. So, and then eventually like branched out and found like Second Life community and stuff like that. And Null is a shapeshifter. Do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Only because I have to, I will say. Hi, I'm Null. I haven't slept this morning, so that's where I'm at today. I'm a shapeshifter. I've been in non-human communities for about a decade and a half now. I got my start in the global vampire community because I am also an energy vampire, and kind of branched out to other non-human circles a couple years later. So I've been around for a little while. Um, I'm an idiot, mostly. That's all you need to know about me. Hi, hello.
And so the first part of our lecture is obviously on anthropocentrism, which is a huge problem for us. Now, would you like to talk a little bit about what anthropocentrism is?
Remember that the stream has lag, and I need to know what slide we're on. Which
This
slide
is
are we on, Noken?
number 4.
Right, we're on number 4. Uh, so what is anthropocentrism? Well, it's kind of complicated because there's no one single idea, belief, or ideology regarding anthropocentrism, but it has a couple ways that it manifests in our culture, especially in the West. And one way to start looking at it is that humanity is at the center of reality and value, which is ontological centricity. And that kind of puts the human as the center of the cosmos, where in an infinite universe, of course, only humans are important. Only the Earth is important. And this kind of goes a little further. Humans look at the human as only human and not an animal. And they create this dichotomy between the human and the animal, which is a false dualism. It treats humans as subjects and non-human animals or creatures as objects, which leads to a lot of really awful behaviors. Um, and humans also look at themselves as being the only kind of being with an identity, or the only kind of being that can be considered a person, which of course we know is wrong, but that's largely the way that humanity looks at itself. And this kind of mentality has been used to justify a lot of really things. And they kind of support this mentality with a lot of arbitrary associations and concepts that make humans, quote unquote, unique, like the ability to learn language, even though we already know and have known for decades that non human animals also engage in language. Humanity will just disregard that and treat human language as the priority or the superior form of language. And this kind of reaches even further, especially into our infancy and our growth as beings, where you're not allowed to be an animal in any capacity if you want to be accepted by society at large. You have to ignore all of the instincts and feelings that the human animal naturally has, not even, considering not a non-human identity in this picture, just regular humans have to ignore the fact that they're animals if they want to participate in the larger society.
Yeah, and that kind of belief is not really, it's not any particular philosophy or ideology or anything like that. It's actually quite difficult to define anthropocentrism, which is why we've given a couple examples of it, and this is by no means exhaustive. Anthropocentrism is more of an underlying sentiment that lies at the heart of many different beliefs, and it's particularly prevalent in Western societies. And we'll go into a little bit of why that is. Now, on slide 5, I
Thank you.
have given some reasons to be critical of this, and even critical of the concept of humanity itself as potentially being an anthropocentric social construct. And actually, there's a whole new field of philosophy called posthumanism and a couple others, like critical animal studies, that are already questioning this concept of humanity. But a couple examples of this, for one, philosophical definitions of humanity, human nature, human destiny, and so on, these are not objective scientific definitions, actually. They're cultural and philosophical definitions. Throughout most of Western history, philosophers, artists, writers, so on, have grappled with this concept of quote-unquote human nature. And that history of that idea is still based in their cultural roots and outlooks on the world. Scientific definitions of the human actually tend to undermine that concept of universal human nature. Basically, what science is doing is revealing that there is more variation among human beings than we realized, and there perhaps are no distinctly universal traits. And then the other side of it is that the traits that humans possess are actually spread throughout the entire animal kingdom. So we're discovering that, or, well, we've basically known, but science is confirming that other species are cognitive agents. They have traits that match what humans do, just in different matters of degree. And right here is this concept of neo-Darwinism. Actually, Darwin was responsible for saying this idea way before our current time. It's little known, but Darwin has a book, I can't remember off the top of my head, on evolutionary psychology. And one of the things he says is that differences are a matter of degree, not of kind. So basically, all the traits that make up the human are actually general animal traits, and what defines a human as one particular species versus another is merely how those traits are organized and clustered. So essentially the same stuff that makes up human language is all spread out throughout the rest of the animal kingdom in different species, in different ways. Another way we could be critical of this is that the social performance of humanity is a learned behavior. So we are taught from a very young age to suppress what are considered animal instincts according to the cultures that we're a part of, and certain behaviors, and even thinking of oneself as belonging or being a part of other species. And this is taught to every children through both the education system and the surrounding social, cultural symbols that we are kind of given just constantly in the world around us, just from being in a human society. And lastly, definitions of humanity are never universal, but rather exclude some form of human from full humanity based upon culturally selected traits for the definition. So historically, this has included women, indigenous peoples, neuroatypical people, people with disabilities, slaves, people of color, and so on. The traits that are selected to define human are considered to be quote-unquote universal, but they are truly coming from the culture that's defining it. And as I said down here, we don't all have the same cognitive nature, even as human beings. So this definition is highly problematic. Going on to the next slide, number 6. There's a quote here from Peter Steve's Animal Others on Ethics, Ontology, and Animal Life. And I won't read this verbatim, but essentially, the context for this quote is Steves is talking about children's nurseries and observations of how children think of other species growing up. And it isn't until they get older and have been socialized into performing an identity of being human that they start to distance themselves from other species. When kids encounter animals, the first instinct in them is to treat them as people, to ask, like if they meet a cow, who is this cow? Not what. It's not about defining the cow as being a different kind of being from themselves. They actually encounter all species as people. And this idea that they have to be socialized into performing that some species are not persons and only we are persons and we have to behave in an exact specific way to fit in our cultures, that's when they start to no longer see themselves as part of other species and no longer see other species as composing parts of their identity. Now on slide 7.
Yes, we have some examples that are both from the past and exist in the present day still of non-anthropocentric worldviews. And Nøkken and I will talk about 2 of them, but we have much more here on the screen for you to see, and they all come from different areas of the world. And there's many more than this. This is just, the ones that we thought were the most interesting. I'm going to be speaking about Celtic and Gaelic totemism. And in these indigenous faiths, the Celtic and Gaelic peoples believed that specific tribes of their persons were directly descended from a particular animal. The one that I'm going to speak about today were the Epidi, and they believed that they were descended from horse, and they believed that they were horses. And this created a lot of interesting social differences, than what you would expect in the modern day. In this case, they thought that eating horse would be cannibalism. It would be like eating your family member, your brother, because to them, they were directly descended from horse. And there were many more ways that this manifested, but like that is a pretty like strong, visceral reaction and association. And then we have the Magyar.
Yeah, and Magyar is Hungarian, which is my own ancestry and heritage. And in Magyar shamanism, there's what's called a Taltos, and this is a kind of shaman that is very specific to that region, but is really related to what Null has talked about with Celtic and Gaelic totemism as well. So in there were ancient Hungarian history, there were 7 clans essentially, or tribes, and those tribes each had their own totemic animal spirit as well. And just like the Celtic and Gaelic totemism, if your clan spirit was, let's say, the Tyrrell bird, that is actually what you are. Like, you may be appearing human, but the Tyrrell bird is actually your real, true spiritual nature. The human form is just seen as a kind of manifestation in this world in a specific way. And the Taltos shamans are kind of unique in that they are specifically animal spirits that have been born into human lives. And there's a lot of records of shamans doing spiritual like combat in the forms of their own animal nature. And this is often bulls or horses, but that would be dependent largely upon the clan's totem. And this practice completely disappeared around, it stayed alive for a while, but around 1000 AD, Geza Vajek converted to Christianity and became King Stephen's, and then suppressed this and almost eradicated. It's kind of survived in the villages of Hungary, where it's a little bit more difficult to control. Now going on to the next slide, the takeaway from these examples is that non-human beings, animals, spirits, etc., are inherently a part of human identity in nature in all of these examples. So essentially, this is not just saying like the animal is a symbol for our tribe or something like that. Actually, in the spiritual beliefs of these peoples, the animal is their fundamental nature and their identity. And that's true for everyone who belongs to that tribe. This is radically different from Western anthropocentrism, which excludes non-humanity and animality from human identity. To be human is to be not animal, to be not non-human. Also note that every example that we've given has a very complex understanding of the different ways that the non-human and human relate in identity. Some cultures do not distinguish between non-human and human. In our previous examples, there was the Amazonian cosmologies, which actually do not have a concept that differentiates human from non-human. All beings are composed of the same spirit, and your physical form is kind of like a clothing that you wear. And their cultural taboos are very strict about not imitating other species openly, because if you do, you'll become that species in the way that they conceptualize being. And some of the other examples we gave express some form of embodiment, and like the Tautosh shaman. So that's someone who is a non-human animal embodied, or other being, like could be a plant or other spirit, embodied into a human life. Now, it's important to note that being non-human doesn't imply that these cultures explain our identities. So you aren't a shaman just because you have a non-human spirit, and you don't necessarily belong to those cultures. But we can learn a lot from exploring these perspectives as long as we're careful not to jump to conclusions appropriate or overgeneralize. So I see it as learning and studying these cross-religion and spiritual perspectives as expanding our concepts and what is possible, and we can use that to think more critically of ourselves. Moving on to slide number 9. Do you want to take this one?
So, yeah. Making sure that my mic is picking up. God, I hate Discord. So where did Western
Gotcha.
anthropocentrism come from? Well, a lot of people associate it with the advent of the Greeks, but this wasn't always the case. An interesting thing to note, before classical Greece, the Greeks worshipped the elements, like explicitly. In their beliefs, the elements were personified as beings, but they were still the elements, the sky and the earth. And it was from these elemental forces which bore the Titans, which eventually bore the more humanoid-looking gods. But in this worldview, pre-classical Greece, they were still connected and intertwined with the elemental natural world. And this persisted even into classical Greece, but obviously was meeting resistance at that point. In the early Greek history, there were even cults or religious groups dedicated to these symbols of the natural world. And of course, we have a fun example here for you. This was a wolf cult, a literal wolf cult for Zeus. They believed themselves to be wolves, and they also personified and viewed Zeus himself as the wolf, or the like Chios. Now, even though this kind of like started to shift as time went on, there were still things in Greek culture that put even like mythical beings still at a higher level than humanity itself. One of my favorite examples, which is also one of the Western world's first paradoxes, not the world's first paradoxes, is the Tiamessian fox. And this was a giant fox sent by the gods. They suspect Dionysus, but that's kind of not clear. To eat children in Thebes because reasons. And obviously people were upset by this. So Creon sent somebody to destroy the beast, but he couldn't do it alone. So this human had to employ help from a magical dog named Laylaps. So here's the interesting thing. The Teomessian fox was a fox that was destined to never be caught, but Laylaps was a dog that was destined to catch everything they chased. So this created a very unfortunate paradoxical situation, and Zeus had to come in and was like, yo, knock that shit off, turn them into stone and cast them into the sky. Happy ending for everybody, I guess. But they still looked at some beings as being more powerful than man, and even the gods had to come in and stop these natural forces. And this kind of ended more towards classical Greece, as I've said. You can take the next slide, Nøkken.
Cool. And on slide 10, as Null was saying, towards the end of the Greek empires, there was a kind of a shift in perspective. There were a lot of socioeconomic struggles, and these led to disillusionment with nature and the pantheon and other things. And one of the big things that, if you take any study of philosophy in contemporary times, they talk a lot about the Socratic tradition. And Socratic tradition is obviously named after Socrates, and Socrates was famous for going through Athens and questioning literally everything and everyone. And Socrates refused the Greek gods and goddesses and followed what he called a personal human daemon, which for him was a human ideal or a hero in human form that he was aspiring to be. So you could kind of see that Socrates has started looking and treating the human as a kind of ideal in and of itself. Now, Socrates kind of pissed a lot of people off, so he ended up getting executed. He had to drink. Yeah, right. And he drank hemlock. I guess that's what happens if you question everything. But then Socrates was still very, very respectful of the natural world. He just was asking questions mostly. And he had a student named Plato, and Plato had a student named Aristotle. And these two kind of really solidified this concept of anthropocentrism that got passed throughout the ages. So Aristotle and Plato both held humanity as above all other life, and as the ends to which all other life served. And Plato argued that concepts like justice, goodness, beauty, and so on were above nature, and by extension, humans are too, because they can supposedly contemplate them. And nature at this point is now seen as a place of baseness, injustice, immorality, and ugly wildness. This is different from what the Greeks viewed it before, because nature before was a world teeming with all kinds of beings, and humans were just one of them. And it wasn't like they were trying to organize everything into a linear hierarchy. Now, Diogenes of Sinope was a kind of contrasting viewpoint of this, and he's one of my favorite philosophers. He was actually a therianthrope. Probably the earliest record that we have of him, that we found at least. He understood himself as a dog quite literally, and would talk about this. And his entire philosophy was based upon the concept of wild animals, being a wild animal as virtuous, and being self-reliant, being questioning human civilization and revealing hypocrisies in it. And Aristotle was trying to define what a human being is in order to set them above other species, and Aristotle came up with this quote-unquote definition where he said that man was a featherless biped, and Diogenes, being kind of a raucous dog that he was, showed up to Aristotle's lecture with a plucked chicken and said, "Behold a man." So, yeah. And Diogenes was very, he believed in embracing being an animal. Now, Aristotle's concept of the scala naturae is really where anthropocentrism comes into play. It's basically organizes nature into a way that humans are rational animals who are above other animals who are irrational, who are above plants that are unfeeling, and then plants are above minerals, which don't have anything. And Christianity later appropriated these concepts and turned it into what's called the Great Chain of Being. And that was a ladder, basically, in which everything in existence was stacked from highest to lowest. So God was at the top, above angels, who were above humans, who were above animals, above plants, above the earth. And this was above the illusionary or demonic. So that would include, quote unquote, pagan ideas like shape-shifting, being non-human, being connected with the natural world. All of those things were considered like essentially illusions that were created by the devil. And you can see here in this next slide that this was a representation of the Great Chain of Being in Christianity a little bit later in the 1500s. And you could kind of see here's God at the top and the angels, humans. And they actually divided animals into different levels, like higher and lower. So they put birds at the top because these were more heavenly, closer to the heavens. And then fish, and then four-legged animals who were considered lower because they were closer to the earth and therefore closer to Satan. And then you have plants and minerals, and then Satan, and everyone's having a party down here.
Having a good time. Don't worry about him.
Yeah, right. And what's really important to note here, and this is this Neoplatonic viewpoint that Christianity appropriated from Aristotle and Plato, is that it's a complete inversion of the early Greeks' respect for nature. I mean, the elements themselves were the most primordial and sacred form of being from which all of this came. So the Greeks, this whole thing is placed at the bottom now, and the opposite, it gets flipped on its head. Humans no longer look to the earth or look up to the earth as their source of value and understanding of who they are. Going on to slide 12.
So, what does all of this mean for us? Obviously, we've talked about it for a reason, right? Well, unfortunately, yeah, there is homework here. So, the West is built around this concept of human uniqueness and exceptionalism. It's everywhere. It's a plague. And our identities and being as non-human are considered to be inherently inferior because of the way non-human animals are treated in a Western anthropocentric world. And the West enforces this distinction between humanity and non-humanity by a concept that we are all only human, and not non-human at all. Our identities aren't allowed to exist under this framework. We aren't allowed to be non-human. And in order for us to participate in society, of course, we have to conform to society's narrative of what the human is and what it's allowed to be. And this kind of presents itself as really uncomfortable situations for non-human persons, especially if you're engaging in self-actualization, which is something that we're going to talk about in a little bit. One of the ways this manifests is derogation, ridicule, mockery, misrepresentation, and the devaluing of our experiences, calling us crazy and saying that either we're making this up or we're only experiencing this because something's wrong with us. Treating our identities and our inherent integral interpersonal experiences as fantasy, considering any non-Catholic spiritual experience to be mythology, and treating it as something that is just a nice little thing to think about or a fairy tale. Pagan beliefs are treated this way all the time in the West, and not even dealing with non-humanity, just that the fact that it's not Western and anthropocentric in nature. Obviously, any form of paganism in general is going to be more integrated with nature. It must be fictitious, if so. And this results in some really unfortunate extremes as well, such as direct harm, harassment, doxing, threat to our welfare or livelihood. Now, this doesn't happen often, but it has happened. It's not fun to experience. Western domestic humans, as I like to put it, react very violently towards any suggestion that they're not unique, that the human is not unique. And one of the most insidious is the indoctrination of our persons, as we spoke about briefly as we are growing up. The cultural upbringing, education, and socialization into the performance of a human identity, performing what you're supposed to be qualified as human. And people are raised to think that being an animal is inherently a bad thing.
And continuing on slide 13, this problem also affects beliefs and spiritualities that we could look to inform our own perspectives, because it's not just our natures and our identities are suppressed, but also any sort of identity or any sort of belief system that expresses a closer relation between nature and non-humanity and human identity. So the West tends to suppress indigenous and non-anthropocentric worldviews in general. So not only we have a double problem of having ourselves dealing with this personally, but also the things that we might look to are also experiencing as well. And it treats its own concept of humanity as universal. So all contrary views to this view are absurd to it. And this creates a real practical problem for us, because language and cultural modes for understanding our non-humanity are kind of suppressed in the West. Like, there's a poverty of symbols and ways of expressing and talking about who and what we are. And pre-Christian Europe and non-Christian, or pre-Christian European and non-European cultures, they had been exploring this concept of non-human being in human identity for generations and generations. And hundreds of years of developing cultural modes and ways of talking about these things is not something you can substitute for or just create. It's something that has to be passed down generationally. Every group of people that comes afterwards builds upon these ideas, refines them, and passes them down through whatever tradition they happen to have. So we're left with the state where those traditions have largely been destroyed. And perhaps if we were born into those traditions, we would have had a place for us already. Or at least we would have had access to the knowledge of those people about our particular natures and our particular conditions, and how we might understand them or question ourselves and grow. So lacking this, we kind of been put into this position where we suddenly have to produce all this, invent it. And you see that a lot in our communities. I mean, people are coming up with new words and new terms all the time. Some might be better than others, but regardless of what it is, we have this need to create that because we just lack it. And there's nothing available to us. We can't look to the societies we're a part of to have these symbols and ways of exploring this. And on slide 14, we have an example of kind of the last big issue that causes for us.
Well, a couple examples, but I
Yeah.
think we're just going to talk about one.
Yeah, just the issue of alpha wolves. So anthropocentrism creates misinformation about non-human beings. And this can really affect us directly because we can be led astray and misunderstand what it is that we think we are. There's actually no such thing as an alpha wolf. David Mick, who popularized the concept of an alpha wolf back in like the 70s, actually has done tremendous amounts of research and writing along with other scientists to reject this concept because it's actually not true. Wolf packs tend to share in leadership in a division of labor sort of style, like with family communes. And no one individual is the absolute head. It's spread out throughout the entire pack. And Western culture kind of romanticizes this notion of the alpha because it reflects an anthropocentric worldview, like where humans are above everything, and even within humanity, there's this hierarchy of I'm the alpha versus the beta versus that. So wolves have kind of been turned into this symbol for humans, and as a result, their actual nature and their kind of cognitive ethological being is suppressed and hidden away. So it's actually kind of hard to get accurate information about what we might actually be. And if you understand yourself as a non-human, a specific one, and you're just kind of new to this, you would want to know exactly what it is that you think you are. Because maybe when you look into it more, you're going to find out that you might be something else than you think you are. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but this misinformation kind of prevents you from further growing and being reflective of your own identity. Now, for the second part of this, we're going to talk more about self-actualization. And this is, Null will talk a little bit about what this is. On slide 16, we have some definitions.
So we've talked about some pretty depressing things. What can we start doing? This is the fun part. We mentioned this term earlier, and it is self-actualization. It is a process by which we realize ourselves in the world and engage in ways of living, empowerment, and self-improvement, which are a full realization of our identities. It means to make one's self actual. So it is a very literal definition here. And you can begin self-actualizing a number of ways. The most important, always going to be at the top of the totem pole here, is critical thinking. Being critical of yourself, your experiences, your identity, the information that you're coming into contact with. Is it a symbol of the animal, or is it actually peer-reviewed research of the animal? And that ties into self-education, which is the second most important concept here. It is so insanely important to educate yourself as much as possible. We're not talking a YouTube video for 10 minutes. We're talking actually going out there and getting a hold of peer-reviewed research and comparing and contrasting and really getting involved in whatever way you can to help you understand if something is right for you or not. And you become empowered through this knowledge. You become empowered to be able to critically examine things in a different light. You become empowered to make better assessments about the experiences you are having and what that means for your identity. And another way that you can engage in self-actualization is engaging in supportive communities and social circles. This is what we're doing right here. We are in the Otherkin community. This is one of many non-human communities out there, online and offline, that engages in support, critical analysis, and sharing of information. And the last point, sharing of information, is incredible in this context. You need to seek out perspectives that may not agree with yours in order to be properly critical of what's going on. Now, that's not a bad thing that somebody thinks differently than you. I know that our society has kind of primed us to think that way, but you're an individual. You're only ever going to have your perspective. You can never have another person's perspective. And the only way to get another person's perspective that isn't intrinsic is to engage with them. And that is going to give you information that you could possibly have not come across yourself. And this creates self-confidence in your assessment and the way that you are approaching these situations, in the information that you know you can draw upon. And this can help defend against stuff like antagonism and the social pressures of an anthropocentric world. If you are better educated, not only about the world around you, but how that world and the information in it relates to your identity.
And since we're non-humans within human lives, self-actualization is necessarily going to be integrating our non-human being into human modes of living that are realistically possible for us. So you can't really, you have to think about what would be healthy for you in this human body, and it might not necessarily be everything you would want or feel compelled to do. And also I wanted to add to something that Null had said about supporter communities. You don't necessarily have to look to just non-human communities for support. There's a lot of communities outside of the Otherkin community that actually are very understanding, and if you approach them and are open and earnest and not defensive about it, people actually are very, very open to hearing you. And I especially found that's the case with like ecological communities and pagan communities. So like reaching out to people who are animal activists. And I found that actually there's a surprisingly large number of people that feel this way, regardless of whether or not they consider themselves non-human. I talked to someone who works as an animal rights activist who said, hey, I totally get where you're coming from. Like, I kind of feel similarly, but just maybe not as intensely as you do. Now, going on to the next slide, in number 17, Null touched upon it a bit, but there's this idea of positive criticism, and we don't have to take criticism as being this inherently bad thing. And I tend to see that our communities don't take criticism very well, even if that criticism is presented in very civil ways. Or individuals may not see the value of having someone's critical perspective. Now, positive criticism really can take multiple forms. One of them is self-criticism, so to be critical of your own experiences and to search for clarity. And this involves not just accepting what you see at face value or what is immediately emotionally satisfying. So what we want to do is take and look at what we experience and what we feel and what we think and ask ourselves questions about this. It's not beating yourself up about it. It's not like demeaning yourself. It's actually asking questions in a positive way. Is what I'm feeling accurate? Is what I'm thinking correct? Are there other ways I could think about it? Are there other things that my experiences mean than what I immediately thought of first? And I really like this idea that criticism from others is a gift. So anytime anyone gives you real criticism, they're taking a lot of time and energy and effort out of their own lives to give that. And it's not meant as an attack on you. It actually, think of how much work it is to suddenly have to recall your own perspective and to draw in all examples of why you think you do the way you do and the experiences you've had living and how these have influenced your thinking. So presenting a different perspective like that to someone else is honestly a lot of work. And when someone does that for you, they're honestly hoping to educate you in their own perspective. Not necessarily for saying what's right or wrong, just what they think. And it's very important to differentiate this, what criticism is, from actual like harassment, mockery, and demeaning. Criticism is not meant as an invalidation of who or what you are. It's meant as a presentation of a contrasting perspective. Now, going on to slide number 18.
So there are methods for thinking critically about non-humanity. One of them is to draw from as many sources as possible and compare that information. The goal is to become more knowledgeable about ourselves, to pursue, obviously, a greater understanding of who and what we are. We can't do that if we're not engaging with anything outside of us. So we can't really rely on one source of information about this sort of thing ever, generally. It's very important to always be pursuing as many different sources as you can individually manage. Obviously, don't drown yourself in a bunch of academic literature. Take it as slow as you need, but kind of keep that in the back of your mind that you should always be looking out for a new piece of information that you can add to the pool and look at it in comparison with other things, because there's many different sources: academic, historic, the individual, cultural, spiritual experiences of many different cultures that are available to us. We live in a very privileged time with the internet that gives us access to all of this whenever we so desire, and we need to just spend time with these kinds of resources.
And one thing that we can also be critical of is those experiences that we have and how we interpret them. Now, I see a lot in our communities of reliance on dreams and visions and such like that, and that's not something that's inherently wrong. It's just there's a way we can be critical of those and extract information better from them, and perhaps maybe our judgment of what they mean might be wrong. So, regardless of if our dreams and our practices are guided or non-guided, these are going to be metaphoric, symbolic, or non-literal. And there's this idea that our physical brain can only process non-physical phenomena within its own limitations. And when we're experiencing dreams and such like that, or have like a deeply spiritual experience, that experience is being filtered through our psychological perspective and our embodiment in our physical body. So if you are a spiritual person, you still are not getting things directly. Like, if you have a vision or something like that, it's often going to be strange, probably surreal. And if we assume that the meaning of this is at face value, we can fall into confirmation bias or misinterpret a real meaning that is behind the symbolism, because it confirms what we already feel and think rather than perhaps offering us different introspective insight. An example I have of my own is when I was engaging in a journey, I met a wolf spirit who ended up becoming my friend. And the first encounter was kind of gruesome. Like, the wolf spirit tore open my own entrails. I was a horse in all of my journeys, so he was essentially eating me alive. Fun. But next second later, everything's back to normal. We're just facing each other and communicating with body language. And what does that mean? Well, I had to like sit on it for a while and think about it, and I went through different interpretations. And at first, you want to think that, oh, they're trying to tell me something. But actually, I ended up interpreting it as they were trying to understand whether my perspective of predators was good. And like how herbivores, predators are not like enemies or something like that. And they were actually kind of assessing that based upon how I reacted to that experience, whether I have animosity still. So my interpretation actually changed, and I realized there's more to it. And this applies also for your teachers, and if you have guides, they don't spoon feed us answers. You have to really think critically of what you receive, whether it's visions or sense experiences or just information that comes to you, and it's just kind of non-literal. Going on to the next slide, number 20.
And another way to approach situations like this, we talked about dreams and visions and all of this stuff, and Nøkken really laid it out here, but I'll talk a little bit more about it in detail. One of the best things you can do, regardless of any manner of identification you have, is conscious meditation, reflection, and analysis. Meditation is not strictly a spiritual thing, although it is often used in spiritual practices. So if you are a spiritual identifying person or a psychological identifying person, meditation is still valid for both of those frameworks. Now, meditation is a state of hyper focus and careful thought. It is not clearing your mind and letting anything just come to it and that's the answer. With meditation, we look inwards and we're thinking a lot about the things that we're experiencing and feeling and thinking. We're thinking about thinking. That's very important. And that's one of the best ways to examine things like dreams and spiritual journeys, or even psychological experiences. Let's say you had a very strange, atypical mental shift of some sort at some point. Sit down and meditate on it. It doesn't have to be in any spiritual light. Just think about it a little further than you do, in your daily life. And this can do worlds of wonder for the way that we look at the things we are going through.
Oh, I really agree with that last point, especially. And on slide 21.
So now, obviously, a lot of these contradictory perspectives that we have spoken about are potentially quite negative, and we will acknowledge this. It's not always going to be positive. However, negative or positive, they are still very important learning experiences. And we learn the most from those who are different from us or disagree with us. Even if the disagreement is, from a completely absurd point of view, as we might assume in certain conversations like this, the goal is not that this person is disagreeing with you. It's hearing a perspective that isn't yours and finding new information that you couldn't have realized on your own. We talked a little bit about that earlier. It's important to carefully consider every perspective and be open to the possibility that we might be wrong. This is more talking about communication within the community. So, conversations you're having with people in Discord, on Amino, on forums. It's difficult, I know, to look at something and look at a suggestion and say, nah, I've got it figured out. But what we really need to be doing is being open to that consideration.
And sometimes our perspectives can actually be fundamentally changed by encountering other people's viewpoints. And I have a personal example of this actually from meeting Null. When I was younger, I was very, very deeply spiritual. I had crazy experiences, and I got really disillusioned around college and started beating myself up. I thought I was just crazy and all that. So I became an atheist and started interpreting and there's nothing wrong with that perspective, just let me put that out there. But for me, it wasn't the right perspective. I started interpreting my experiences as I was ill and there was no value to them and nothing like that. So I left being spiritual and all that for a while, and until I met Null again. And when Null started giving their perspective of spirituality, at first I was very dismissive. I wouldn't listen to what she was actually saying. I would just reject it outright. But when I started to finally listen, I realized that she wasn't trying to say this is objective or in the same thing everyone's oh, this is right or wrong. She was actually presenting her perspective. And I found that her perspective really resonated with me, and I let myself actually start exploring that again, and it's been one of the best things that's actually happened to me. I stopped hurting myself over who I am and my experiences and my natural inclination to be a spiritual person. And sometimes when you meet someone who has a different perspective, maybe you won't get along with that perspective. Null and I got into arguments a lot over this. But that can really... Oh, were you saying?
Many arguments.
Yes. Sometimes...
Many arguments.
Sometimes you just need someone either to give you positive criticism or, in this case, kind of kick your ass about it. And actually, it really helped. I was very happy with that in the end.
In the end.
Yes. And then on slide 22, this is very important for, actually, we're going to talk about this in two different ways, one for living physical species and one for spiritual beings. For living species, it's very important to do research on what you think you are. So research the science of the species that you think you might be. And this includes finding really reliable scientific sources, articles, books, research, educational texts, and documentaries. Don't take perspectives of just people who have had experiences with animals. If they could be wrong about how they're interpreting behaviors and stuff like that. You need reliable information. And this is important because your goal is to compare what you're innately experiencing to what you think you are. So if what you're innately experiencing doesn't actually match what the actual species is like, then you might need to consider other things. You might be something else than what you think you are. Maybe still non-human, but maybe a different being. And you could also engage in direct interaction. I highly recommend this if it's safe. Domesticate animals are obviously easier. not all of them are safe for you to just go to. Like if you don't understand how to interact with horses, you can actually get seriously injured. So it's very important to make sure you know what you're doing. But for wild animals, you can also visit sanctuaries, observatories, conservancies, and contact ecologists and conservationists. And you might not necessarily be able to interact in the wild, but you might be able to observe them and have guided information from someone. And actually, when I was young, Thane Maynard actually had this thing where I got to meet and interact with bear cats. So it's very rare to actually be able to see a bear cat, and Thane Maynard had educational programs at the Cincinnati Zoo for that.
Kind of running over time.
Oh, gotcha. Cool. We'll get through the last ones pretty quickly. So number 23.
So what if your species or identity or being that you are isn't exactly something that you can go interact with in a sanctuary? Well, there are still resources for spiritual, non-physical, and mythological identities. There's a lot of information, both good and bad, out there about the non-physical, about spiritual practices, modern day and historical. Consume as many of these sources as possible. And like we said, be critical of all of them. Compare, contrast, see how it applies to you, see how other people interact with these materials, and try interacting with people that also engage in these things as well. The reasoning rather than the identity is really what should be scrutinized when it comes to a non-human identity of some kind. There is a little too much focus in our community on what you are rather than why you identify that way. So we need to be focusing more on the whys rather than the what. And like I said, constructive criticism doesn't seek to criticize what people think they are or experience themselves as, just their reasoning. Research anthropology and comparative religion and spirituality. There's a lot of that out there too. Spiritual experiences are kind of on the rise as Christianity is losing its grip on the world after it burned it to shit. So there's a lot of reconstructionist movements popping up. Get engaged with those if that aligns with your identity and your beliefs. They are cropping up everywhere. There are resources for you. So just keep in mind that you might be what you think you are, but you could still be operating under some incorrect assumptions. You can totally, the prevalence of wolves in our community, they could totally be wolves. They just might not exactly understand why. And that's perfectly okay. That is part of the process. Both Nøkken and I have totally been there.
Yeah. And I won't go through all the information here because we're kind of short on time, but one idea that has come up in the pagan communities is this idea of UPG, VPG, and SPG as a way of thinking critically about your spirituality. And you want a mix of all of these, and you want to see how these interact and contradict each other. So UPG is like your personal experiences, beliefs, and subjective views. Those are valid. Like you can draw from what you physically experience. In some ways, we're taught by modern society to downplay our own personal experiences, and that's not really healthy for us as animals. Now, you want to still compare that. You can't just rely on UPG because then you can end up with any sort of belief and not necessarily critical ones. So VPGs is like historic sources, traditions, verifiable informations from reliable teachers and leaders. Sometimes academic research, like the examples we gave earlier of Celtic, Gaelic, and Magyar spirituality. Null and I look to actual anthropological texts on those and reconstruction because we want to know what those are actually about historically as well as we can. And SPG is this idea of people arriving at the same experience or conclusion independently. So when two people have different experiences completely independent of each other, but they happen to be the same, you can look to that and be like, this is interesting. And also sharing experiences and perspectives with other people. So SPG is really intersubjective. Like you're comparing and contrasting your experiences with other people's experiences. And there needs to be a certain amount of openness for that to happen. And this doesn't just apply to mythological species, it also applies to spiritual animal folk and living species, because a lot of these cultures have spiritual understandings of other species and have spent a lot of time focusing on that species' nature. And it's probably, just to summarize the last part, you always want to make sure that it's actual spiritual knowledge versus empty symbolism. Like, know the difference between an animal being used as a symbol for humans versus a culture that is actually trying to, or tradition that's trying to explore what that actual animal's nature is. And it can be really hard to differentiate the two sometimes. Like, and it's almost like it's a process you can't ever stop thinking about. And then our last slide, number 25.
And in general, be a perpetual student of life. That is really simple to say, but it's also really difficult to do. We know that. And we want to present a concept to kind of keep in mind when it comes to this. And it's called aporia. It's a state of always being unresolved. And that can sound terrifying. But I've been doing it for a number of years, and honestly, it's been a lot better than just assuming that I had everything figured out. I'm a lot more open to everything, and it's just, I personally find it a better way of approaching the world. We need to come to accept that this state of always learning and discovering what we thought was wrong is a very positive thing. And that is not to say that you are always wrong. It is not. You don't doubt yourself 100% of the time. Don't be overly critical. Don't abuse yourself. Just be open to the fact that that's a part of life, is being wrong. And we need to have openness about these, these things that we perceive as negative. We need to be in a state that is receptive to the world around us, and that includes different sources of information and the perspectives of the individuals that we are interacting with. Related is the concept of aporia, which is all knowledge is open-ended. Nothing is final, especially not the way we view our identities. And no matter how much we have things figured out, there is always the chance that we could be wrong. I could be wrong. Nøkken could be wrong. We could wake up tomorrow and realize that these identities that we've had for over a decade, there's something off. That's okay, though. It's totally okay. That means there is more to learn. There is more growth to be had. And just obviously don't focus on this, 24/7. Just become comfortable with the idea. There's a lot of pressure in our community to have yourself figured out as fast as possible and to say that you know 100%, but realistically, there is no 100%, and that's okay.
And before we let you guys get going, I want to thank you also all for coming and listening to our lecture and us ramble about topics that interest us. We're currently working on a couple of projects, and Wildpath is going to be releasing research at some point. We're working on a book that's going to cover a lot of topics that you heard today and a lot more. And we could only really gloss over these ideas. Like, there is so much more to them, and ways of being critical of, like, anthropocentrism, like exploration of different concepts behind non-human embodiment, human lives. And Null and I have been working on this for a long time, and
way too long.
Yeah, I know, right? And it's starting to solidify finally. Just so much information to try to distill and process. But one of our things is that book, and we're looking to hopefully get it published. Now,
and don't worry, the book is by community members,
yes,
for the community. When this book is done and published, it will be available for free to every person in the community that wants it. If you want a copy of this when the project is complete, probably at the end of this year, maybe at some point next year, it's a lot. I can tell you, it's a lot.
Yeah.
It will be available for free at anybody's leisure.
And Null and I are talking about doing a podcast similar to what we did today, but would be able to go into much more depth and talk about these issues very
If
specifically.
if y'all want to listen to us ramble about this stuff, but for like much longer, that's going to become a possibility soon through our community as we talk about and work out the whole specifics of potentially doing this podcast thing. So yeah, if you really want to like make your brain hurt for a little bit, look forward to that.
And then we've got our website that's currently being built up. There's some things on it right now, but it's mostly under construction. And that's really like what Wildpath actually is meant to be, a sharing of community resources that encourages people to share their art, their music, their ideas, and write essays and such. So it has open submissions too, and we hope to be hosting a lot of different work. Right now, we've got Stephanie Shea, who we worked with pretty closely. She has her dissertation up on her website, which she did a study of Otherkin. She's a religious studies scholar, and that's about it. If you
Um,
are,
I
oh,
do want to
sorry,
mention that the file that was linked for this panel, the last 3 slides has everything that we sourced. So
yeah,
if you want to go and look at all of our sources, it is available in the file that was provided. Not all of these books can be gotten online, but many of them can, and we do have links to the ones that are available. So if you definitely want to look into anything that we discussed specifically in this panel a little further, you do have the bibliography at the end of this slide in that file.
cool. And thank you all for coming again, and I hope you guys all enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of Othercon. And thank you guys for hosting us.